In the spring of 1815, 10,000 miles from European shores, something stirred beneath the tropical waters of the Dutch East Indies. Mount Tambora, a towering peak on the island of Sumbawa, had been rumbling for months. Local inhabitants spoke of strange sounds echoing from the mountain's depths, like distant thunder that never ceased. Then, on the 10th of April, the earth itself seemed to split open. The explosion that followed would be heard across an ocean. Ships sailing near Java, 800 miles away, reported sounds like cannon fire so loud their captains prepared for naval battle. In Sumatra, over 1,000 miles distant, the British garrison thought enemy forces were attacking and sent troops to investigate the mysterious booming. But this was no human conflict. Mount Tambora had just unleashed one of the most powerful eruptions in recorded history, hurling rock, ash, and gas 15 miles into the heavens. The mountain, once standing over 14,000 feet tall, lost more than 4,000 feet of its peak in a single night. Entire villages vanished beneath rivers of molten rock and choking clouds of ash. Yet the true horror was only beginning. As the volcanic debris settled across the Indonesian islands, something far more sinister was taking shape high above the earth. Millions of tons of sulfur compounds had been blasted into the upper atmosphere, where they began forming a veil of tiny particles that would circle the globe like a shroud. The people of 1816 would soon discover that when you wound the earth deeply enough, the entire world bleeds. Strange reports began arriving in London and Paris by the summer of that year. Ships' captains spoke of sunsets so brilliant they seemed to set the very sky ablaze. Yet the sun itself appeared weak and pale, as if viewed through smoked glass. The light that reached the earth carried an eerie quality, casting everything in hues of copper and gold. But beauty can be the mask of catastrophe. In New England, farmers watched in bewilderment as their crops withered under June frosts. Snow fell in Vermont during the second week of that month, piling 6 inches deep while songbirds froze in their nests. Thomas Jefferson, tending his gardens at Monticello, recorded temperatures that plunged to 37 degrees on the 4th of July. Across the Atlantic, English grain rotted in the fields under endless rains and sunless skies. The harvest that should have fed nations simply failed to grow. In Switzerland, the summer proved so cold and dreary that a young English poet named Lord Byron found himself trapped indoors at Villa Diodati near Lake Geneva. The constant gloom pressed upon his spirit like a weight. He penned verses that captured the world's strange new darkness. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless. Byron was not alone in his confinement. With him stayed Percy Shelley, his physician John Polidori, and most remarkably, 18-year-old Mary Godwin, who would soon become Mary Shelley. As the cold rains drummed against their windows and lightning split the perpetual twilight, they challenged one another to write ghost stories to pass the endless gloomy hours. From that challenge, born of a world gone dark, Mary Shelley would craft her tale of Victor Frankenstein and his monstrous creation. The novel that emerged from those shadow-haunted days would become one of literature's most enduring works, a story of science overreaching nature's bounds. How fitting that it sprang from a time when nature itself seemed to have lost its way. Yet the darkness touched more than poets and dreamers. Across Europe, the failed harvests brought something far more terrible than literary inspiration. In Ireland, the potato crop withered, and families began the grim mathematics of starvation. Parents counted their children against their dwindling stores of grain, making choices no human should face. In the German states, crop failures drove the price of grain beyond the reach of common folk. Riots erupted in markets as desperate people fought over moldy bread and spoiled grain. France, still recovering from the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, found itself facing a new enemy that could not be defeated with cannons or cavalry. The wine harvest failed catastrophically. Ancient vineyards that had weathered centuries of war and pestilence succumbed to the strange, cold summer. In Normandy, apple orchards stood barren, their fruit blackened by unseasonable frosts. The wealthy retreated to their estates and waited out the crisis, but for the common people, there was nowhere to hide from hunger's advance. In the mountainous regions of Switzerland and Austria, avalanches rumbled down slopes at the strangest times, as if the very mountains were unsettled by the world's new strangeness. Glaciers, fed by the unusual cold, began advancing down valleys where they had not been seen in living memory. Alpine villages found themselves threatened by walls of ice that crept forward like frozen rivers seeking the sea. Across the ocean, American farmers faced their own mysteries. In New Hampshire, a man named Chauncey Jerome recorded that his sheep, seeking warmth, broke through fences and huddled against his house. Wild birds, confused by the constant chill, forgot their migration patterns. Flocks that should have flown south remained north, while others attempted to migrate in the wrong seasons entirely. The natural world itself seemed to have lost its ancient wisdom. In China, monsoon rains arrived with devastating fury, flooding the Yangtze River Valley and drowning entire provinces under brown, churning water. The imperial records speak of dragons weeping tears of mud, but behind such poetic language lay the stark reality of failed rice harvests and mounting famine. The celestial balance that had governed the Middle Kingdom for millennia appeared to have been disturbed by forces beyond the emperor's power to command. India's monsoons also turned erratic and violent. The carefully calculated rhythms that had sustained civilization in the subcontinent for thousands of years suddenly became unreliable. Regions that depended on precise seasonal rains found themselves either drowning under torrential downpours or withering under unexpected droughts. The complex dance between wind, water, and warmth that nourished the rice paddies fell into chaos. What made these global disruptions so bewildering to those who lived through them was their simultaneity. In an age when news traveled at the speed of sailing ships and horse-drawn carriages, the idea that similar catastrophes might be striking across distant continents was almost impossible to grasp. Each nation, each region, believed its suffering was unique, unaware that the same pale sun looked down upon failed harvests from Ireland to Indonesia. The year 1816 became known by different names in different lands. Americans called it the year without a summer, or 1800 and froze to death. In parts of Europe, it was remembered as the year of the beggar. Chinese records refer to it as the year when summer was like autumn and autumn like winter. But perhaps the most curious aspect of this global catastrophe was how long it took for anyone to connect the distant volcanic eruption with the worldwide climate chaos that followed. The idea that events on a remote Indonesian island could influence weather patterns across the globe was simply beyond the scientific understanding of the time. It would be decades before investigators began to piece together the connection between Tambara's eruption and the climatic disasters that followed. Even then, many refused to believe that a single mountain could wield such power over the entire planet. The notion seemed to violate the very order of creation itself. Yet nature had provided its own evidence for those who knew how to read the signs. Tree rings from forests across the northern hemisphere show the unmistakable signature of that terrible year: narrow bands of growth, stunted by the cold and darkness. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve chemical traces of Tambara's sulfurous breath, locked in frozen layers like pages in an ancient book. The eruption's effects rippled through human society in ways both obvious and subtle. The crop failures drove massive migrations as desperate families abandoned failed farms in search of better prospects. Many headed west in America, accelerating the settlement of the frontier. Others crowded into cities, creating conditions ripe for disease and social unrest. In London, the coal smoke that normally dispersed in summer breezes hung in the air like a perpetual fog, creating some of the first documented cases of severe urban air pollution. The combination of volcanic particles in the upper atmosphere and coal smoke closer to the ground created a double layer of atmospheric contamination that would influence urban planning for generations to come. Artists and writers of the period found themselves strangely inspired by the apocalyptic atmosphere. The painter J.M.W. Turner created some of his most dramatic works during this period, capturing skies that glowed with unnatural fire while the earth below remained shrouded in shadow. His contemporaries often criticized these paintings as unrealistic, not knowing they were witnessing one of history's most accurate documentations of a world transformed by volcanic winter. The German composer Franz Schubert wrote some of his most haunting melodies during the dark summer of 1816, capturing in music the melancholy that seemed to permeate the very air. Musicians across Europe noted that their instruments responded differently to the strange atmospheric conditions, wood expanded and contracted in unusual patterns. Metal took on different tonal qualities, and even the human voice seemed to carry differently through air laden with volcanic dust. Medical records from the period reveal another curious effect of the prolonged darkness and cold. Physicians noted unusual patterns of illness, particularly disorders related to what they called melancholia and nervous exhaustion. Without understanding the role of sunlight in human health, doctors struggled to explain why so many of their patients seemed to suffer from profound sadness and lethargy that lasted far beyond the typical duration of such afflictions. The economic consequences proved equally mysterious to contemporary observers. Global trade patterns shifted as traditional agricultural exports failed, and new trade routes emerged to connect regions with surplus goods to those facing shortages. The price of grain fluctuated wildly across international markets, creating fortunes for some speculators while ruining others who had bet on normal seasonal patterns. In the American Midwest, where wheat and corn crops failed catastrophically, many farmers abandoned agriculture entirely and turned to other pursuits. Some became traders, following the new economic opportunities created by scarcity. Others moved into early industrial work, contributing to a shift in American labor patterns that would have lasting consequences for the nation's development. The year without a summer also marked a turning point in human understanding of global interconnectedness, though few recognized it at the time. For the first time in recorded history, people across continents experienced simultaneous climate catastrophe, providing evidence that the Earth's systems were far more intricately connected than anyone had previously imagined. Religious leaders of various faiths struggled to interpret the signs and portents that seemed to fill the darkened skies. Many preached that the end times were approaching, pointing to biblical prophecies about the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood. The brilliant sunsets caused by volcanic particles created spectacular displays that seemed to confirm ancient predictions of cosmic upheaval. Others saw in the global suffering a call for moral renewal and social reform. The shared experience of hardship broke down some traditional barriers between social classes, as aristocrats and peasants alike faced the same cold, hunger, and uncertainty. This leveling effect would contribute to political and social movements that emerged in the following decades. The scientific revolution that would eventually explain such phenomena was still in its infancy. The systematic study of weather patterns, atmospheric chemistry, and global climate systems would not develop for another century. In 1816, the best minds of the age could only document the strange events without understanding their cause or connection. Yet some observers displayed remarkable intuition. Benjamin Franklin, who had died decades before Tambara's eruption, had theorized that volcanic activity might influence weather patterns after studying the effects of Iceland's Loki volcano in the 1780s. His insights, largely ignored during his lifetime, would prove prophetic when applied to the far greater catastrophe that followed. As the strange year finally drew to a close and normal weather patterns gradually returned, survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives and communities. The experience had shaken fundamental assumptions about the reliability of natural cycles and the predictability of seasonal change. Many who lived through 1816 carried with them a deep wariness of depending too heavily on any single harvest or assuming that next year would necessarily resemble the last. This hard-learned wisdom would influence agricultural practices, food storage methods, and economic planning for generations. The children who grew up during the year without a summer would tell stories to their grandchildren about the time the sun forgot to shine and snow fell in summer. These tales, passed down through family histories, kept alive the memory of nature's terrible power long after the immediate crisis had passed. In the end, the year without a summer stands as one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of how a single geological event can reshape human civilization across the globe. Mount Tambara's eruption killed an estimated 71,000 people directly through volcanic devastation, but the indirect casualties from the climate chaos that followed may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The volcanic winter of 1816 revealed the fragility of the systems upon which human society depends, the delicate balance of temperature and precipitation that enables agriculture, the complex web of trade that distributes resources across the globe, and the social structures that hold communities together during times of crisis. Today, as we face our own global climate challenges, the year without a summer offers both a warning and a reminder. It shows us that the Earth's climate system can change rapidly and dramatically, affecting every corner of the planet simultaneously. But it also demonstrates the remarkable resilience and adaptability of human communities when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges. The dark summer of 1816 eventually ended. The sun returned to its full strength, and harvests recovered. Life found a way to continue, as it always has, carrying forward the hard-won wisdom of those who survived the year when the world went dark and learned to see by starlight until the dawn returned.